follows an extract from my book Fête Fatale, available from Amazon. Chapter 4, Part 3. The general atmosphere of the continuing fête was untouched by the death of John Barlow, and as Dr. Wainwright walked into the crowd, the atmosphere of an ongoing holiday was refreshing. There was an unofficial gathering at the cakes and preserves stalls, and the hot topic of a joint first prize had been superseded by the news of the death. General milling around and subdued chatter rippled under the external noise of the fête. A separate bubble had formed a nucleus within the festivities as people quietly discussed the tragedy and what bearing that might have on the day. Nobody was certain what they ought to do next. As they were discussing matters, Fred Bruff's men carried John's body away. It was a discordant sight, the dark jackets and striped trousers of the funeral garb in the midst of the holiday apparel of the fête. The festivities were due to end soon, and the Templeton singers had planned to round off the day by singing Jerusalem, with the Mossleigh WI joining with them. There didn't seem to be any reason why this shouldn't go ahead as planned, and so the singers began to make their way to the area where Richard was waiting at the keyboard. Jonty and his chums had torn themselves away from the badger and, after glancing approval from May, looked over the music on the keyboard stand to check which key to play in before they took up their positions to join in. Everyone was surprised to see Jean take her place in the alto section, but her neighbours quickly shuffled aside to make room for her. With a gentle squeeze on her shoulder, they then joined the rest of the choir to watch May's baton for the downbeat to start singing. Music ever was a restorative to the soul, and in the light of recent events there was more than one dewy eye in both the choir and the audience. Nathaniel, Matt, Drew and Terry had joined the crowd on hearing the news, and the music united them all in their sorrow. It uplifted and encouraged them too. It seemed a fitting tribute to both the close of the fête and also a suitable impromptu memorial service to John Barlow, who had been liked by all. The only member who looked resolutely unmoved was Jean. In her newly acquired widow status, she appeared frostier than ever. It would affect her more deeply, no doubt, and who could tell how grief could affect those it touched most? If anything, this made her plight all the more sorrowful, and caused her to look more fragile than any demonstrative outpouring of grief ever could. At last the instrumental strains of the coda faded away, and Jean's friends led her kindly back to the village hall. There didn't seem much more that they could do. Brass band music had always deeply affected Beth. The piercing tones of the trombone touched her to the core. She always thought that the trombone had a plaintive timbre, and she was now crying openly. Drew came alongside her and embraced her, letting her tears naturally ebb away. After a moment's pause, the spell broke and people began to drift away. The fête was nearly over, and Eileen and Betty volunteered to escort Jean home, thinking it not right that she face an empty house alone just now. The rest of the WI stayed behind to begin the Herculean task of tidying up once the final visitors had left. Darcy moved to take up her position at the entrance-cum-exit of the fête with her cash box at the ready to take in the tithes and donations from the external stall holders. She sat in her capacity as treasurer, rather like an abbot balancing his ledger at the close of St. Peter's Fair. It was advisable for Darcy to display a certain amount of trust in such a venture, to insist that each stallholder count out every penny of their earnings, and for her to cross-check their tally so as to be able to accurately calculate the percentage due would have been far too time-consuming and would have been damaging to customer relations. Nevertheless, she kept a shrewd eye on business throughout the day, and if an apparently busy stallholder professed minimal takings, she wouldn't be hoodwinked. Soon the representatives of the official WI stalls would also begin to drift in with their day's takings. The costs of hiring the hall and the field and the purchase of refreshments to sell on, along with any other valid expenses accompanied by a receipt, would need to be deducted from the sum total of the day. Even so, the day promised to prove financially successful. The first to submit their takings were Emma and Henrietta. Their stall had sold out some time ago, and they needed to get their tired children home. Nathaniel, Drew and Beth would stay behind to help clear up. Matt had left to return the car as the choir was singing Jerusalem, and the tractor and bags could be removed once the tidying up was organised. Bereft of his sports car, Terry made his way to the refreshments hall and rolled up his sleeves to get stuck into the washing up. After the joviality of the day, it was usual during this last part of the proceedings for volunteers to sag. Once well-stocked and artistically displayed stalls were now bound to look dilapidated, and the stalls looked as tired and dishevelled as the vendors themselves felt. It was natural for a lull to occur before helpers could once again launch into action to get the clutter cleared away and the gazebos dismantled. A certain amount of brushing oneself down and finding of a second wind was needed before labour could resume. The sadness and shock of John's death seemed to rob everyone of that second wind, and it took May a good deal of chivying before activity recommenced. The only real sense of motivation was the fact that many of the volunteers had got late evening bookings in the restaurant of the Badger. The landlord's son was chef in residence and was making quite a name for both himself and the pub. He was well on the way to Michelin stardom. No matter what the day had brought, it wouldn't do to keep the chef waiting, and they were all getting hungry. A final push achieved the required result, and when the lights in the village hall were finally switched off, the would-be diners were grateful to press their way through into the restaurant of the Badger, where there was no shortage of appetite or conversation. For the full book of Fête Fatale, available in paperback or as an ebook, follow the link in the cards in the description box or find details on my website at sharonbill.com. Thanks for listening.